remind me so much of my father, like some of the humor, because he had a sense of humor too. People might not know, you know, but those scenes just remind me of my childhood. You know?
Ziggy Marley has finally opened up, and it's not the tribute fans expected. In a rare and raw revelation, Ziggy steps beyond the music and the myths to reveal a side of Bob Marley the world has never truly seen. At the center of it all,
what do you remember most about your dad?
The discipline, the work ethic, the sacrifice, seeing him, be good to people.
A long-delayed project that Bob always dreamed of, but never lived to complete. Now, that dream is real, but the truth it unearths, far from easy. You may know Bob Marley, the icon, but are you ready to meet the man behind the myth? Stay with us. What Ziggy reveals might just change everything you thought you knew. He wasn't just my father, he was the world's. Ziggy Marley's decision to break his silence about his father, Bob Marley, begins with one of the most difficult truths he's carried. Bob Marley didn't just belong to him. From the time Ziggy was a child, he had to navigate a strange emotional reality. His father was both a global symbol and a man he barely had time to know personally. While the world adored Bob Marley as a prophet of peace, rebellion, and spiritual unity, Ziggy saw something different at home. A father who was often absent, consumed by the weight of his message, his fame, and the world's constant demands. "My smile is honoring him," Ziggy says, underscoring the emotional tug-of-war between admiration and quiet grief. Public adoration may have immortalized Bob, but it also widened the emotional gap between father and son. Growing up under the intense spotlight of the Marley name meant Ziggy never experienced a normal relationship with his father. While most children remember moments of everyday parenting, Ziggy's memories of Bob are laced with performances, studio sessions, and public appearances. There were no extended periods of just being a father and son. There were fragments, glimpses, and flashes between tours and political strife. Ziggy doesn't criticize his father directly, but he does speak plainly. Bob's physical presence was inconsistent, and his emotional presence even more so. The man who wrote Three Little Birds as a comforting anthem for the world left behind children who needed that reassurance more than anyone. Ziggy notes that even when Bob was alive, he wasn't always there, adding a painful layer to what most would consider a heroic legacy. This public-private conflict didn't just shape Ziggy's childhood, it shaped his identity. In interviews and reflections, he acknowledges how he continues to be seen primarily as Bob's son, rather than as an accomplished artist and father in his own right. Despite his own Grammy wins and philanthropic efforts, the shadow of Bob Marley looms large. Ziggy shares that fans often expect him to perform his father's music at concerts, and while he does so with love, it's a constant reminder of what was lost. A real, grounded father-son relationship. For Ziggy, these performances aren't mere tributes. They're emotional reckonings with a bond interrupted too soon. What makes Ziggy's perspective powerful is not bitterness, but clarity. He understands the myth of Bob Marley and respects the impact it's had on the world, but he also recognizes what that myth cost him as a son. Ziggy is not trying to dismantle his father's legacy. He's trying to complete it. By telling his truth, Ziggy gives the public a fuller picture of Bob Marley, not as a perfect icon, but as a complex, driven man whose greatness came with personal consequences. And in doing so, Ziggy isn't just stepping out from behind his father's shadow, he's asking the world to see Bob through his eyes, not just as a hero, but as a father he still deeply misses. And just when Ziggy thought the spotlight was heavy, one terrifying night made everything painfully real. The night of the assassination attempt. In December 1976, Ziggy Marley's childhood took a violent and unforgettable turn. At just 8 years old, he was suddenly thrust into a nightmare when gunmen stormed the family home in Kingston, Jamaica, in a politically charged assassination attempt on his father, Bob Marley. The attack left Bob wounded with bullets to his chest and arm, while his wife Rita was shot in the head. Ziggy recalls the chaos vividly, being ripped from his bed and taken by police to a hideout in the hills, not knowing if his parents were alive. While the world viewed Bob as a peace ambassador, the Marley household was under siege, and Ziggy was forced to witness that terrifying duality: the global icon versus the man hunted for his influence. For the young Ziggy, the night wasn't just about gunfire. It was the moment his perception of safety was permanently shattered. In his words, the experience was scary but kind of exciting, a telling sign of the way trauma can become normalized in a child's mind. But beneath that initial awe was a profound, lingering fear. The Marley home, often romanticized in reggae mythology, was not a sanctuary. It was a battleground, physically and politically. Bob's growing influence in Jamaica's tense political climate made him a target. And that reality wasn't theoretical for Ziggy. It was something he lived through. The emotional fallout from that moment never fully left him. What's striking about Ziggy's recollection is not just the event itself, but how long he kept it buried. Only recently has he chosen to speak about that night in raw detail. His decision to share it now suggests a readiness to challenge the sanitized narrative that has followed his father for decades. For many, Bob Marley represents harmony and resistance through art. But for Ziggy, the image of his father bleeding and defiant just days later at the Smile Jamaica concert is complicated. That performance was hailed globally as heroic, but Ziggy saw a man who had nearly died stepping on stage as if nothing had happened. It wasn't just courage. It was burden, pressure, and perhaps denial. This attack wasn't an isolated incident. It became a defining moment in Ziggy's understanding of who his father truly was. It also reinforced that being Bob Marley's son didn't mean protection. It meant inheriting danger and instability. Even decades later, Ziggy continues to unpack what it meant to grow up in a household simultaneously revered and targeted. The trauma of that night and the silence that followed left Ziggy with scars that the world couldn't see. And now, by breaking that silence, he's letting the public into the part of Bob's life few ever imagined: the violence, the fear, and the painful cost of being a symbol of change. The man behind the message. Bob Marley is globally revered as a messenger of peace and unity, but according to Ziggy Marley, that public image barely scratches the surface. In his most revealing reflections yet, Ziggy challenges the sanitized perception of his father, stating bluntly, "People love my father, but he had violent tendencies. He was a fighter." This isn't a son trying to tarnish a legend. It's someone reclaiming the full humanity of a man the world turned into a symbol. Ziggy reveals that behind the famous lyrics of love and resistance was a man shaped by hardship, survival, and trauma, an emotional reality rarely acknowledged in public narratives. To Ziggy, understanding Bob's volatility is crucial to understanding the cost of his strength. Raised in the streets of Trenchtown, Bob Marley was hardened by circumstances that demanded more than musical talent. They demanded grit. His nickname, Tough Gong, wasn't a marketing creation. It was earned in the streets, long before international fame came calling. Ziggy emphasizes this as a critical part of his father's makeup. Bob's fight wasn't just political. It was personal, internal, and often unresolved. He carried emotional scars that were never fully addressed, and those wounds sometimes showed up in ways that contradicted the peaceful image he portrayed on stage. That contradiction didn't go unnoticed by Ziggy, who grew up watching the tension between message and behavior play out at home. Ziggy doesn't sugarcoat what it was like to witness his father's intensity. Whether in the studio or at home, Bob operated with a sense of urgency and pressure that could turn volatile. He was driven, focused, and demanding, not just of others, but of himself. And while those traits fueled some of the most timeless music ever created, they also made him difficult to live with. For Ziggy, his father's restlessness wasn't confined to political activism or songwriting. It was a part of who he was, the result of a life lived in the balance between revolution and survival. The peaceful prophet revered by the public was, in private, a man constantly wrestling with demons. This complexity is what Ziggy is now asking the world to acknowledge, not to diminish Bob Marley's legacy, but to deepen it. The real Bob Marley was not a one-dimensional figure of peace. He was a man forged in struggle, navigating a world that rarely gave him room to rest. By speaking openly about his father's volatility and the emotional toll it took, Ziggy is adding context to the myth. In doing so, he reminds us that behind every revolutionary is a human being, flawed, tested, and shaped by pain. Bob's obsession with physicality. One of the more surprising aspects of Ziggy Marley's recent revelations about his father is the role sports played in Bob Marley's daily life. Far beyond a hobby, Bob's love for football, boxing, and running wasn't just recreational. It was therapeutic. Ziggy recalls that his father was fanatical about sports, a detail that may surprise those who primarily associate Bob with music and spirituality. But for Ziggy, this obsession wasn't just about staying active. It was how his father coped with the immense emotional pressure and restlessness that came with being Bob Marley. The pitch, or the ring, became the few places where Bob could lose himself, release tension, and escape the expectations placed upon him by the world. At home, Bob's intensity didn't fade when the instruments were packed away. According to Ziggy, it simply redirected, often into physical competition. Whether it was kicking a football with school children or shadowboxing in the yard, Bob was always in motion. Ziggy paints a vivid picture of his father showing up at his school, not to watch from the sidelines, but to lace up and join the game. This wasn't just for show. Bob Marley, in those moments, was fiercely competitive, channeling the same drive he brought to the stage. It was a big part of his life, and my life as a child around him, Ziggy said, highlighting how sport became a consistent thread in their otherwise fragmented relationship. But there's a deeper layer to this behavior. Ziggy now understands that sport was more than just a pastime. It was a mechanism for emotional regulation. In a life constantly under pressure, from political threats to international fame, Bob needed an outlet. The demands placed on him as a father, a cultural figure, and a national icon were immense. Football and boxing gave him a momentary reprieve from the relentless pace of his world. As Ziggy sees it, these were not luxuries. They were necessary for Bob's survival. In retrospect, the passion for physicality wasn't just part of his personality. It was part of his coping strategy. Ziggy's reflections on this point aren't just nostalgic, they're revealing. They help unpack the quieter, less obvious signs of how Bob tried to manage his internal chaos. While many see Marley's music as his greatest form of expression, Ziggy suggests that the football field or the boxing mat might have been just as vital to his father's well-being. And perhaps, for brief moments, they offered a version of Bob Marley the world rarely saw, free from the burden of being a prophet, just a man chasing a ball or clearing his head. Through Ziggy's eyes, sport becomes a key to understanding the full emotional spectrum of his father's life. A complicated marriage, Ziggy, on Bob and Rita Ziggy Marley's most emotionally charged revelation, centers on the complex, often painful marriage between his parents, Bob and Rita Marley. While the public frequently romanticizes their relationship as a musical and spiritual union, Ziggy's perspective is far more sobering. He describes their marriage as a complicated blend of loyalty, betrayal, and emotional erosion. Bob's many affairs were widely known, and Rita's steadfast presence is often portrayed as unwavering support. But behind closed doors, Ziggy saw something different. In a rare moment of raw honesty, he stated, "She killed him emotionally and spiritually." It's a chilling observation from a son who witnessed the tension firsthand and struggled to reconcile love with emotional harm. Bob and Rita's relationship was shaped by both passion and power. Rita wasn't just Bob's wife. She was his creative partner, bandmate, and eventually caregiver during his final battle with cancer. Yet Ziggy doesn't shy away from pointing out the imbalance in their dynamic. Bob was deeply possessive, not wanting other men to even look at Rita while he fathered children with other women. That double standard created a toxic undercurrent in their marriage that, according to Ziggy, slowly tore away at the emotional foundation of their bond. Though both were unfaithful at times, their relationship endured more out of shared history and duty than sustained affection. Ziggy's account strips away the illusion of a perfect love story. Instead, it reveals two individuals bound by legacy, pantai, and responsibility, rather than mutual healing. Even as Rita stood by Bob in his final days, managing his care and supporting his needs, Ziggy couldn't ignore the unresolved emotional fractures between them. It's clear from his statements that he holds both admiration and lingering resentment. He acknowledges Rita's sacrifices and strength, but he also highlights the pain they caused each other. To Ziggy, their relationship was both essential to Bob's success and devastating to his spirit. What Ziggy ultimately exposes is that love, in their case, wasn't enough to mend the deep emotional wounds. Their bond was defined by survival rather than serenity, and while their loyalty was real, it came at a cost. Ziggy's decision to speak openly about this aspect of his parents' relationship isn't meant to assign blame. It's meant to tell the full story. A story where commitment existed alongside pain and where public admiration masked private heartbreak. By shedding light on this reality, Ziggy is asking fans to recognize that behind the music was a family grappling with complexity, conflict, and emotional scars that never fully healed. But just when the emotional weight at home seemed overwhelming, distance added a new kind of silence Ziggy never saw coming. A son left behind. During one of the most transformative periods in Bob Marley's life, his physical distance from his family created a lasting emotional divide, one that Ziggy Marley is only now addressing openly. After the 1976 assassination attempt, Bob left Jamaica for London to recover and escape the political chaos. There, he found a kind of creative refuge and wrote some of his most iconic music, including 3 Little Birds. But while Bob was healing and making history, Ziggy, then just a child, was still in Jamaica, left to process the trauma of violence and the absence of a father who, once again, wasn't there when he needed him most. For Ziggy, this wasn't just physical separation. It was the deepening of an emotional gap that never fully closed. Ziggy doesn't speak of this time with bitterness, but his words carry quiet resignation. "When you reflect back, you can feel sad," he said in one interview. "But in that moment, you got to do what you got to do." These are the words of a boy forced to grow up quickly, going to school, living a routine, and holding his family together in Bob's absence. While the world was inspired by the uplifting lyrics of 3 Little Birds, Ziggy saw those same lyrics from a different perspective. They weren't just soothing words from a musical legend. They were a reminder that the comfort Bob provided to millions was not something he had offered his own children in that critical moment. The London years exposed a disconnect between the man the world revered and the father Ziggy barely knew. Bob was immersed in studio work, spiritual reflection, and the writing of Exodus, an album later named the best of the 20th century by Time magazine. Meanwhile, Ziggy and his siblings were adapting to a new normal without their father, one marked by the aftershock of violence, the silence of separation, and the absence of guidance. Ziggy doesn't accuse Bob of abandonment, but his silence over the years has signaled the emotional toll it took. Now, by breaking that silence, he's finally expressing what was long buried, that he needed his father during that time, and he wasn't there. This chapter of their story adds another layer to the public image of Bob Marley. The world gained timeless music during his time in exile, but his children lost the closeness of a parent they were still learning to understand. Ziggy's revelations offer a rare and painful glimpse into the costs of that legacy. While the world remembers Bob's London years as prolific, Ziggy remembers them as lonely. He didn't just lose time with his father, he lost the chance to truly bond with the man behind the music. And that absence, more than anything, left a mark that even decades of success and understanding couldn't fully erase. Final words. Lifelong burden. In one of the most emotionally heavy moments of Ziggy Marley's recent reflections, he revealed the final words his father, Bob Marley, ever spoke to him. "On your way up, take me up. On your way down, don't let me down." For Ziggy, these words have echoed throughout his life, not just as a farewell, but as a lifelong mandate. The phrase sounds like wisdom passed from a father to a son, but to Ziggy, it became a profound weight, part spiritual instruction, part personal burden. He didn't just lose a father, he inherited a responsibility that would shadow every step of his career and personal journey. Ziggy interprets this final message as both blessing and curse. The idea of taking Bob up has meant more than preserving his father's musical legacy. It's meant holding up a global icon's reputation, message, and myth while navigating his own path as an artist and man. For decades, Ziggy has carried the pressure to represent Bob's values, live up to his genius, and be a cultural standard-bearer for Marley's message of peace, resistance, and spiritual awakening. But doing so has come with the fear of ever letting him down, not just as a son, but as the inheritor of a global movement tied to one man's name and image. Even now, with a successful solo career and multiple Grammy Awards, Ziggy admits that those words still haunt him. They're not just a tribute or encouragement, they're a legacy coded in obligation. Every time he steps on stage or speaks about his father, Ziggy is reminded that the world doesn't just see him, they see Bob. And that means any failure, artistic or personal, could feel like a betrayal of that final instruction. This emotional weight isn't often visible to fans who celebrate Bob Marley's life, but for Ziggy, it's a daily reality. That one sentence, spoken during Bob's final moments, encapsulated a complex inheritance that Ziggy has been trying to live with ever since. Ultimately, Ziggy's decision to publicly share those final words signals a turning point, not just in how he sees his father, but in how he views his own life. It's an attempt to process the gravity of a dying man's last request and to show that the burden of greatness is not just measured by achievements, but by the invisible pressure to carry someone else's dream forward. Ziggy's journey has not just been about honoring Bob, it's been about surviving that honor. And in breaking his silence, he's finally acknowledging how much that one phrase has shaped and strained his life. Ziggy's quiet critique. In one of the most subdued yet critical moments of his public reflections, Ziggy Marley offered a pointed critique of the people who surrounded Bob Marley during his final months. Without naming names, Ziggy expressed his disappointment in what he saw as a failure of care and judgment by those closest to his father. "He was sick, and no one pulled the plug," Ziggy said, referencing the grueling workload Bob endured despite his declining health. This wasn't just a comment on physical exhaustion. It was an indictment of a system and a circle that, in Ziggy's view, prioritized legacy and performance over humanity and healing. Bob Marley was already terminally ill when he continued to perform and tour, traveling between countries for treatments and appearances. To many fans, these moments were inspiring, a man determined to sing until the end. But through Ziggy's eyes, these moments now appear exploitative. He suggests that the very people who should have protected Bob, who should have said enough, instead kept him moving, working, and exposed to the demands of fame. Ziggy's words imply that those around Bob were either in denial or too invested in the image of Bob Marley the icon to protect Bob Marley the man. The weight of Ziggy's disappointment lies in what wasn't said outright. Was there pressure from the record label? Was the Marley brand already too valuable to pause for compassion? Ziggy doesn't point fingers directly, but his tone is one of sadness and restrained frustration. He hints at a culture of silence and reverence that left little room for vulnerability or decline. In speaking now, Ziggy is doing more than airing grievances. He's raising difficult questions about the responsibility of those closest to cultural icons. When does devotion become neglect? And how do you measure love when it's tangled with legacy? Ultimately, Ziggy's quiet critique is less about blaming individuals and more about revealing a pattern of disregard that allowed his father to deteriorate under the spotlight. It's a painful admission that Bob Marley may have been failed, not just by institutions, but by people who should have known better. Ziggy's perspective forces fans to reconsider the final chapters of Bob's life, not through the lens of myth or music, but through the stark reality of a dying man still being asked to perform. In breaking his silence, Ziggy is calling attention to the price of greatness and who pays it when no one dares to say stop. The weight of a legacy. Ziggy Marley, despite achieving significant success in his own right, including 8 Grammy Awards and a respected solo career, continues to face an enduring challenge, being seen first and foremost as Bob Marley's son. In recent interviews, Ziggy has been candid about this burden. He acknowledges that no matter how far he's come musically and personally, the world often defines him in relation to his father's towering legacy. While he accepts the admiration fans have for Bob, Ziggy also admits that it complicates his ability to fully establish his own identity. He lives in the shadow of a man celebrated as both a global cultural icon and a spiritual leader, making it nearly impossible to be evaluated on his own merits alone. This struggle becomes most evident during his live performances. Ziggy has shared that audiences frequently expect him to perform Bob Marley's songs, and while he obliges out of love and respect, each performance is far more than a simple tribute. It's an emotional experience, a reckoning with the absence of a father he barely got to know, and a way to keep a bond alive that was never fully formed in life. When Ziggy steps on stage and sings his father's words, he's not just honoring a musical legacy. He's confronting a deep personal grief and the expectations that come with being the son of someone immortalized by the world. Even as he builds his own legacy, Ziggy admits to feeling boxed in by the Marley name. It's a blessing and a burden, one that grants access and reverence, but also limits how people perceive his creativity and message. He's more than just the carrier of his father's music. He's an artist with his own voice, shaped by the same pain, pressures, and insights that marked Bob's life, but not defined solely by them. Still, Ziggy has noted how hard it is to convince people of that nuance. In the eyes of many, his accomplishments are viewed as extensions of Bob's greatness, rather than independent achievements. Ziggy's reflections reveal a son still navigating the complexities of legacy, loss, and public perception. He's not just dealing with the weight of his father's myth. He's trying to live a life that honors it without being consumed by it. This isn't a story of rivalry or rebellion. It's about carving out space in a world that refuses to separate the man from the lineage. For Ziggy, performing Bob's songs means reliving both the pride and the pain, an emotional duality that continues to shape his path as an artist, son, and individual seeking his own identity amidst a name that changed the world. Just when carrying the Marley name felt heaviest, Ziggy took on a project that forced him to confront everything it truly meant: producing the One Love biopic. Ziggy Marley's involvement in producing Bob Marley. One Love marks one of the most personal and significant projects of his career. For Ziggy, this biopic wasn't just a cinematic undertaking. It was the fulfillment of a dream his father never got to see or realized. According to Ziggy, Bob Marley had long wanted to make a film that would go beyond his stage presence and music, something that captured the full scope of his humanity. Ziggy stepped in not just as a producer, but as a guardian of that vision. His goal wasn't to mythologize Bob further, but to peel back the layers and reveal the man behind the legend, the father, the revolutionary, and the flawed human being shaped by struggle. In bringing the film to life, Ziggy took on more than just creative responsibility. He faced the emotional toll of revisiting parts of his father's life that were painful, misunderstood, or deliberately obscured. He has said the process required him to confront decades of unresolved feelings, especially around the emotional absence and complex legacy Bob left behind. Telling this story meant looking at Bob not as an untouchable figure, but through the lens of a son still wrestling with the impact of his father's choices. Ziggy didn't want to present a sanitized version of events. Instead, he pushed for a narrative that acknowledged Bob's contradictions, intensity, and the burdens he carried privately. But producing One Love also came with a personal cost. Ziggy has admitted that revisiting his father's life, especially with such intimate access to old footage, memories, and family dynamics, was emotionally draining. He didn't just relive Bob's rise to stardom, he relived the trauma, the separations, the unresolved pain that had shaped his own childhood. In many ways, the film forced Ziggy to reconcile with a legacy that has long overshadowed his own. The pressure to get it right wasn't just about honoring the Marley brand. It was about preserving a narrative that had, for decades, been filtered through global adoration rather than family truth. Thanks for watching. If this gave you a new perspective on Bob Marley's legacy, hit that like button. Got thoughts? We want to hear them. Drop a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that dig deeper than the headlines. And if you're ready for the next chapter, click the video on your screen now. You won't want to miss what comes next.